Folks, please join me in welcoming to the podium my colleague, Professor Timothy Lubin, who's a professor here of religion. Tim has degrees from Columbia and Harvard. He's taught at Harvard and UVA before coming to W&L in 1997. Tim teaches courses on Asian traditions, the comparative study of religion, law and religion, and publishes on a wide range of topics. He recently co-edited Hinduism and Law, an Introduction. Professor Lubin will talk about India a millennia ago, how the colonial era laid the groundwork for a globalized India, and how globalization is having unforeseen consequences. Welcome, Professor Lubin.
Thank you, and welcome to you all. So I actually sketched out a millennium ago. That's a long time ago. That's a lot of material to cover in 10 minutes. So most of my remarks are going to have to touch on the modern period, but I am going to contextualize a bit more because I think that's something that often gets left out of discussions on globalization, as if it's a completely unique modern phenomenon. If globalization is basically the increase in trans-regional integration and cultural exchange involving trade, movement of people, and networks of knowledge, it's been going on in Asia for a long time. More than a millennium ago, India was the driving force in the spread of political systems, religion, and trade, both on the Silk Road and in the Indian Ocean. Sanskrit manuscripts found their way to Afghanistan, to the Gobi Desert, to China, and local kings in Indonesia and Cambodia issued decrees in the form of Sanskrit inscriptions, Sanskrit being the sort of language of official discourse and high culture in India in those days. So even as far afield as Borneo and Cambodia, you're finding Sanskrit inscriptions. And lots of goods, of course, were moving back and forth as well, not just this sort of language of discourse and economic goods. Jumping ahead almost 1,000 years, the arrival of European explorers on India's coasts in 1498 ushered in another phase of globalization, the colonial era. Eventually, the British elbowed the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danes, and the French aside, and proceeded to export Indian raw materials and other treasure, and Indians themselves as indentured laborers to other portions of the British Empire. In other words, the Indians were getting globalized. While importing into India the cultivation of coffee and tea, which are two of the businesses they were interested in, and importing also their own legal and educational institutions, their mores, and their ridiculous pith helmets, trains, so many other things. The legacy of this process is that some of them are really mundane, right? Tomatoes, potatoes, and of course chili peppers are considered essential to the Indian cuisine, but they didn't have any of them before 1498. Right? And meanwhile, English is spoken today all over India. It's the de facto national language of India. It's not the official national language of India, because that wouldn't be right, because that's the language of their colonial overlords. But it's the de facto. And it's also one of the things that makes India have a competitive advantage. Not always fully exploited, but anyway, a competitive advantage in the globalized market today. And at the same time, Brits back at home are living cheek by jowl with Asians, and it's often joked today that Indian restaurant fare is the new English cuisine. Changes such as these come for better and for worse. And if there's something different about globalization today, it's mainly the speed and intensity with which it's happening. And the consequences, now as earlier, are often unforeseen and not always welcome. I have time to mention just a few examples. First of all, the fears that globalization would mean mostly westernization of the rest of the world have only partly been realized. One of the counter examples to that is the Indian film industry. I don't know how many of you watch Bollywood films, but you may have at least noticed in the popular media that they get quite a lot of attention nowadays. And we've even had some major motion pictures produced in this country that draw on the style and involve some of the stars of the Indian screen. But it should be noted that India has, by many measures, the biggest film industry in the world. They actually have multiple film industries because they have multiple languages. But the biggest one is the Hindi film industry based in Bombay and affectionately referred to as Bollywood. Bollywood films fill millions of theater seats across Asia, the Near East, and Africa, even in countries where nobody understands Hindi. In other words, they're an export commodity, very much the way American cinema is. And the remarkable thing is, when one thinks that, oh, American products are so, it generates so much enthusiasm all over the world, which indeed they do. I would say that in India, most Indians prefer Indian cinema. The American films are showing, but in a very few theaters. I saw Home Alone there. And I have to say that Titanic was a Titanic success. But these are the exceptions to the rule. They're not watching every new movie that comes out. The Bollywood films are the ones they're watching, or in the other language areas, they're local cinemas. It's a big, big business. But it's a big business well beyond India. And I think a lot of the money that they're earning off of it is coming from very far-flung places. This, along with India's prominence in certain other fields, notably IT, information technology, and some of their big success companies like Infosys, and even in heavy industry like ArcelorMittal, right, buying up European companies. This is also, on the economic side, signs of success or globalization in a positive sense from their side. It's not just a one-way relationship. Other aspects of Indian culture have also spread in the West, but in some ways to Indians' consternation. Lately, many have been dismayed to see how yoga has been popularized, watered down, reinterpreted, and in their view, denatured, as it has become more popular here. There have in fact been strident calls for Hindus to reclaim yoga as a religious practice rather than as a fitness craze or mental well-being type activity. Something similar has also happened with traditional Indian medicine, Ayurveda. Ayurvedic, anyway, I'll put it in square quotes, patent remedies have become a lucrative business all over the world, and Indians have often been outraged to find that American and European companies have tried to secure patents on substances that they have been using for 1,000 years or more. In both of these cases, Indians are realizing that they risk losing control of their brand. Indians settled today in the US have also been irritated when they send their kids to school and discover how their culture is depicted in their American school textbooks. And in 2005, one activist group brought an unsuccessful lawsuit in California to get those sections rewritten. This latest dispersal of Indians across the globe, this time a willing dispersal, has confronted them with diverse legal regimes that they have to navigate as well. One side effect of this that I've encountered is a sort of what they call forum shopping, in which women sometimes have sought to annul an unhappy marriage in the US, getting a judgment of some sort of fault against their husband in the process, so that they can take that judgment back as a foreign precedent and use it in the Indian legal system to expose their erstwhile husband to harsh statutes on the books there that were enacted to protect Indian brides from dowry-related harassment. Right? Something that we don't have here. And because these two legal systems are so different in the historical circumstances that produce them, so different, the judge here doesn't understand what's at stake, right, for the parties when they go back home. In India itself, people are of two minds about globalization. Insofar as it brings more wealth, international quality goods and services, and other modern conveniences like the now ubiquitous mobile phone, which is really, of all of the modern conveniences, the one that has benefited probably the widest swath of different strata of Indian society. Everyone has a mobile phone, or more than one, literally. There must be more mobile phones in India than there are people. So in those situations, they're generally happy with it. But the headlong rush into an American-style consumerism is generating a host of externalities, mostly unanticipated. A landscape, first of all, that's just strewn with packaging waste, which the villagers in particular are not accustomed to having to deal with. Right? In the old days, your food came wrapped in a banana leaf, you just threw it in the ground. If it's made of plastic or laminated paper, you're going to be looking at it for a long time. And they haven't adjusted. And the government has not, back in the 70s, right, I remember when I was a kid, there were all these public service campaigns, don't be a litter bug, and Smokey the Bear and so forth. That sort of thing has not happened. Maybe we can blame the Indian government for that. But this sort of adjustment to the new consumer society is not happening. Right. And also, well, everyone wants a motor vehicle now. The motor vehicles are getting bigger, and the air is getting terrible, and traffic is, the roads, the infrastructure is just not there. And most of all, with the growing middle class, prices are going up. To follow the growing middle class, but there's a wide swath of rural poor who are getting left behind with that. They just can't follow, they can't keep up with those price rises. And they're just not seeing most of the other benefits that globalization and integration in the global economy is supposed to be bringing them. The final factor I'm going to mention is the role of NRIs, what are called NRIs, non-resident Indians. The emigres and expats and their offspring living in places like the United States and fashioning nostalgic or reformist views of the mother country, which get channeled back in the form of political influence accompanied by a lot of cash. So they are also, then you have these Indians, many of whom are now US citizens, not even citizens of India anymore, but they still identify with India, they still recognize themselves as ethnically Indian. And they're sending lots of money back home to make things happen there, politically, that go along with their romantic notion of what the old country ought to be like, or how it ought to return to be. Right? So that's another factor that, in the globalized South Asia. This is, to some extent, reinforcing more liberal social attitudes, particularly in urban India, women being the chief beneficiaries of this, greater liberty, personal liberty for women. But in some cases, it's also generating rather fierce pushback from conservatives and nationalists who are afraid of losing something intrinsically Indian there. For example, in one part of North India, reinvigorated traditional caste councils, these are sort of community councils, headed by the sort of village headman or something like that, have begun at times issuing judgments against young couples who, with the sanction of the laws of the secular state, violate the old rules against intercaste marriage. So these councils then pass a judgment and often carry out rather harsh, I mean extremely harsh in some cases, punishments, what we would call extra legal, although of course they regard it as legal, it's traditional legal. This is one of the responses then to the globalized India. Such, in other words, are the complexities of globalization. To navigate this world and to recognize what's at stake for all parties involved, both parties here and parties abroad, is precisely what we're hoping to educate W&L students about. Thank you.
Folks, now please join me in welcoming to the panel my colleague Joel Blecher, who has a degree from Princeton's Department of Religion, specializing in Islamic studies. He studied at the University of Damascus in 2006 and 2007, and has undertaken extensive research in Syria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and India. He's currently teaching a course on Islam and modern Islamic political thought. He'll be speaking on Islamic law in an era of globalization, and will specifically address the issues of free speech and blasphemy. Welcome, Professor Blecher.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction. So the month of Ramadan ended just about a month ago. As many of you know, Ramadan is a time where Muslims all over the globe abstain from food and drink from sunup to sundown, discovering, among other things, brotherhood and sisterhood through this shared experience. But within this apparent global unity, there's also much variation among the amount of time Muslims spend fasting, in part because sunrise and sundown are regionally contingent on the Earth's tilted orbit of the sun. Some of this variation is quite old, stretching back to the early Islamic conquest, which had, at its widest point, expanded from Andalusia to India. But some of this variation in our era of globalization has blossomed into disagreements quite unanticipated by centuries of Islamic jurisprudence. In parts of Scandinavia, for example, a place relatively new to Muslims, the sun does not set in June. Are individuals living in these communities to be expected to go a month without food for their fast to be valid? Some jurists are of the opinion that Muslims there ought to follow the times of sunrise and sundown for their nation of origin. But what about Swedish-born converts to Islam? The debate wears on, and even if we lived in a world with a caliph or a centralized global Muslim authority, it would not always be clear who has the final word on Islamic law. For anyone who fasts in Ramadan, the desire for their fast to be acceptable to God is of the utmost importance. To anyone who does not, this uncertainty may sound like a relatively banal example. So I would like to speak a little about an issue in Islamic law you may be a little bit more familiar with, the issue of blasphemy and free speech. While not dependent on the tilted orbit of the Earth around the sun, I would like to argue that it is just as contingent on the variety of regionally and historically constructed boundaries and expectations. Our story begins with a Muslim scholar who died in 11th century Syria named Abul Ala al-Ma'arri. Other than the fact that Ma'arri died in 11th century Syria, he might have fit in well among Lexington's more artistic, organic, or outdoorsy types. He lived in a small mountain town. He was an imaginative poet, and he was a vegan. In Ma'arri's lifetime, he did see limits on his freedom of expression, no doubt. For one, he complained that the patronage system in Baghdad, in which the wealthy elites paid poets to praise them, severely limited his creative output. He lamented likewise that a roving warlord that attacked his village in northern Syria had coerced couplets from him, another severe limit. Surprisingly, however, Ma'arri felt at leisure to critique religions, including Islam. He even wrote a Dante-esque account of the Day of Judgment, in which he satirized an inept and chaotic bureaucracy of otherworldly judges struggling to sort the righteous from the wrongdoers, unable to keep track of the necessary documentation, and unable to weed out those smarmy souls who tried to hobnob their way into heaven. Believe it or not, Ma'arri was never persecuted for these beliefs, never burned at the stake, never targeted by a fatwa. On the contrary, students flocked to study with him by the hundreds. It was only centuries later that more conservative biographers would accuse him, baselessly I might add, for writing a parody of the Quran and committing blasphemy. Even then, his books were not censored or burned, but continued to circulate freely in the medieval and modern Muslim world. In fact, to this day, busts of Ma'arri grace Syrian plazas in Damascus, and streets are named in his honor, in almost every other major Syrian city. Now, the example of Ma'arri is not meant to cover up the figures, movements, and events, some of them terribly violent, that have given rise to protests, polemics, and outrage surrounding blasphemy, from the Salman Rushdie affair to the Danish cartoon controversy, or the YouTube video trailer that circulated just last year, which many of you may recall sparked protests across the Middle East and South Asia, although it was later shown to be wrongly linked to the attack on the US Embassy in Benghazi. It is rather to underscore the point that the concept of blasphemy and freedom of expression, especially in an era of globalization, requires us to pay particular attention to the historical, political, and regional context of these events. In other words, if there is a clash of civilizations, a Kulturkampf, between a society that values freedom of expression and one that seeks to enforce the Sharia, then why did we see outrage in certain pockets of the Muslim world, but not others? Why in our own period, but not others? One further danger of framing this as a problem between Sharia and freedom of expression is that it buys into the myth that the concerns of the protesters in Libya, Egypt, and Pakistan over last year's video could be satisfied if only speech were regulated through some international legal means, or through an international legal system that better accommodated or embodied the principles and rulings of Islamic law. Yet, as many Muslim public intellectuals have argued, the protests were not so much a demand for an international or global legal remedy, but a more visceral response to moral injuries and moral offenses directed at groups of individuals in the complex context of massive unemployment, decades of armed conflicts, forced migrations and displacement, and internal and external political and religious repression. Our larger task then, which I raise as an ongoing assignment rather than one that can be completed in this short talk, is to learn about the regionally constructed political and historical environment in which these protests emerged, and how they define the harm that blasphemy causes. The offenses caused by last year's YouTube video are all too easy for us to understand, even for those of us who are non-Muslims, mostly sheltered from the horrors on the nightly news. This video was not only Islamophobic, it was actually homophobic. It was anti-Semitic, racist, sexist, and pretty much every other kind of ist. The video is hurtful to watch, and it is a pain that the law, or some kind of international law, may be ill-equipped to prevent or remedy, especially in a globalizing world in which actors in different legal jurisdictions can throw stones at one another over the internet. More to the point, taking recourse to the more conservative interpretations of Islamic law that call for severe punishments for the defamation of Muhammad is also not very helpful, since many of the worst offenders are outside of the formal jurisdiction of any Islamic court. This is not to say, as political theorist Andrew March reminds us, that there is no place for the law in regulating speech. Laws matter. The fact that the quote-unquote innocence of Muslims video bubbled up on YouTube rather than on American television is no accident. After all, the video was sexually obscene even by American standards and would have violated federal law if it had been broadcast on television, since obscenity is prohibited by the Federal Communications Commission. Moreover, a legal approach offers some basic protections, especially to religious minorities, who are finding it difficult to gain acceptance in Western societies. To this end, the Anti-Defamation League has sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed in serving as an advocate and watchdog for Jewish groups and others when facing anti-Semitism in the public sphere. Ironically, the successes of these lawsuits are not characterized by legal victories that limit speech, but their ability to bring awareness of prejudice and bigotry to the light of the American public. Perhaps then, there may be a growing need for an analogous organization that can advocate for the legal rights of the Muslim community in the West and across the globe. Freedom of speech then is not only a concern for the Terry Joneses and Sam Basiles of the world, but also moderate and forward-thinking imams in mosques all over the country who seek to freely express their opinions during Friday sermons without intimidation or arrest. But the law is a double-edged sword in our globalized and globalizing world. As we have seen, in most cases, prohibition adds to the problem. A Facebook page calling for an International Dra Muhammad Day is an example of how the prohibition of defamation can simply multiply the joy and desire to flout it. Flouting the law, in turn, feeds the fire for those already outraged that a further violation has occurred. Again, another irony of these events over the years has been that the ones most responsible for multiplying the circulation of these materials are also the ones most outraged by them. Criminalizing a speech act, then, can never be a replacement for raising consciousness and building a global culture of mutual respect and sensitivity. It should be clear by now that in an era of globalization, more alternative strategies beyond the law are needed. Unfortunately, what those alternative strategies are or ought to be is not clear. My hope as a professor at WNL is that our students, both those who encounter and engage Muslim communities from within and without, at both home and across the globe, will be better at building bridges and offering substantive answers to these tough questions than I am. And they will be on the right path if they are complicating absolutist frameworks, attending to the paradoxes in our own conception of free speech, and keeping in mind the regional and historical context in which outrage over blasphemy occurs. Thank you.
Finally, folks, join me in welcoming to the podium Larry Boetsch, who is a Washington and Lee alum from '69, is a professor of Romance languages and director of the Center for International Education. Larry was a member of the faculty from 1976 and a senior administrator from 1996 to 2003. He then worked with the Christian A. Johnson Foundation to found the European College for the Liberal Arts in Berlin, and served as its first president. He's one of the 3 founding executive directors of the European Consortium of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Since 2008, he has overseen the formulation and implementation of a strategic initiative for the integration of global learning into the undergraduate curriculum at WNL. Welcome, please, Professor Boetsch.
Well, thank you, Michael. I, not for the first time, find myself at a significant disadvantage. I often share the podium with my colleagues on the faculty, and I am invariably impressed, as you have been, with their knowledge, with their expertise, with their capacity for synthesis and articulation. I'm at a disadvantage because I'm a professor of Romance languages. And once again, my request to speak in Spanish has been denied. So I will do my best in English. Much of what I have to say this evening or this afternoon is a little bit different. I'm not here as a specialist in economics or in Islamic law or in religion or India. I'm here as the director for international education, and really just to explain to you in a few words how the university is responding to the kinds of issues and problems that are raised right here by my three colleagues. Now, just listening to them gives us a clue as to why we think global learning and the integration of global learning into a Washington and Lee degree is important. When I came back to WNL in 2008, President Rousseau asked me to think strategically about global learning and the curriculum and the direction that it should take here at the university. And having had some experience in administration at WNL, there were a couple of things that I kept very much in mind. Whatever effort we made would have to have an anchor that was shared by the entire university community. Fortunately, I quickly discovered two important anchors that we continue to rely upon. The first was some of the language in the university's strategic plan, the overall strategic plan, which is now in the midst of implementation. And there was a little section in there regarding precisely international education. And having been an administrator, I greatly admired the vagueness of that language. Words like encourage, nurture, cultivate, not a single detail that would tie us down. But that was important, the fact that it was part of our strategic plan. The other anchor, and I go back to this over and over again, the other anchor has to do with our public commitment as a university. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Washington and Lee mission statement. Often mission statements aren't taken very seriously, but I've always taken it seriously because that's what we're telling people that we do. And it turns out that in the WNL mission statement, we say quite clearly that every WNL graduate will be prepared for engagement in a diverse and global society. That is what we tell the rest of the world. That is a guarantee that we put upon each of our graduates as he or she takes off into the world. So, to begin the process of thinking strategically about global learning, I simply asked the question, is that true? And the answer was, no. No. So from there we said, okay, if that's not true, that is, we can't guarantee that every one of our graduates is prepared to live in a global and diverse society, what do we have to do to make that possible? And the whole process is meant to begin with that statement and to end with that statement, but to come up with a different answer. So over the past 5 years, and for the next who knows how many years, we've been thinking very carefully about what we call global learning. Now, just like globalization, and just like my colleagues here pointed out, global learning at WNL is not new. It's something that's been going on for a very long time. I had a curious adventure the other day. I don't know if you've seen on the website, but in the renovation of Robinson Hall, there was this terrific archaeological find. What was it like to be in a college between 1810 and 1834? Do you want to know? Well, you just look down in that pit, because it's where everybody was throwing things in that time here on campus. So I asked our campus archaeologist, Allison Bell, professor of archaeology, I said, Allison, have you found any remnants of any kind of international influence on campus during that time? She said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, we did. We found a button from Kentucky. So, I confess, this is nothing new. This is nothing new at WM. So what actually have we been thinking about? It's true, we've had global learning at WNL, and just like many other liberal arts colleges, we've had courses in all kinds of international things over here, and we have a fair number of students who study abroad over there, and we have a number of faculty members who have research colleagues abroad, all kinds of things spaced around the campus. So our job, we think, is to bring those things together into some coherent way, to consolidate those things in a positive way, taking advantage of our university strengths, so that at the end of the day, our graduates, in fact, will be prepared for that global and diverse society. We've looked at all kinds of aspects of this. So there are curricular aspects, there are study abroad aspects, there are community aspects, there are alumni aspects. And one of the things that we decided early on was that this had to be the broadest possible base of stakeholders in the process. So when we began the process and began talking about it and all the various elements of it, we made sure that we included faculty, staff, students, alumni, friends of the university, people in the community. And that has made a huge difference, because it's a vast experience that we bring to bear upon the kinds of decisions that we make about how this should eventually work its way into a Washington Lee education in a comprehensive way. I'll give you an example of the way we've been thinking about these things, and the example I will use is study abroad. Now, if you pick up any magazine that describes university education, and you look at numbers for study abroad, you'll find, first of all, that the actual number of students who study abroad in the United States is very low. The percentage normally is very low. But if you look at our peers, for example, small liberal arts colleges, the numbers are good, right? So our number, for example, is somewhere anywhere between 55 and 60% of a graduating class will have spent time abroad. And that's average for our peer group. Some are a little higher, some are a little lower. But we looked at that number and we said to ourselves, oh, wait a minute, wait. That is a meaningless percentage. It doesn't tell us anything. Why doesn't it tell us anything? Well, because it doesn't distinguish between the student who spent a year abroad living with a family in Jordan learning Arabic, and a student who spent 4 weeks with one of our own professors and 8 of their fellow students in London. Now, I'm sorry, but those are not the same experience. Right? Nevertheless, each of those experiences has a value, a real value. So when we began to think about study abroad, we began thinking about the value that each of those experiences has, and ways in which we could realize the potential of each of those experiences. And we are taking now a really innovative approach to study abroad. First of all, we make it clear to students that this is not, and many of you may or not know this, but students today are heavy into credentialing. You know, I mean, they come with a whole checklist of things that they have to accomplish by the time they're finished here. And often on that checklist there's a little box that says study abroad. We don't want students thinking about it as a box to check off. It's not a credential, it's an experience. And it's not an isolated experience, or a discrete experience, or even a personal experience, if it is done in the context of a university education. For a study abroad experience, whether it's a year in Jordan learning Arabic, or whether it is a week in Italy with the chamber singers, requires 3 stages. It requires that the student be prepared for the experience in a way that will make that experience or have that experience realize its full potential. It's not waking up one morning, grabbing your passport and taking off. That's not an educational experience, that's a tourist experience. Right? Study abroad and tourism are two different things, vastly different things. It has to do with helping the student understand ways while they're away to make the most of that experience and relate it to what has come before and think about its relationship to what will come after. And when students return to campus, it is absolutely essential that in order to take that experience in, to make it transformational, they have ways to express and articulate and reflect upon the experience. Too often students come back, this happens all the time. Students come back from study abroad, you run into somebody on the colonnade, and that person says, I haven't seen you, where have you been? Right? I've been to Cambodia. Really? How was it? Well, but there's no answer to that. Where do you begin to say, how was it? Well, you say great. And the reply usually is, oh, good, well, I'm glad you had a good time. Don't forget about the party Friday night. So what happens is that these experiences become isolated and discrete and personal. We think students who study abroad can be a tremendous resource for internationalizing our campus. There are a lot of ways to internationalize a campus. A lot of it has to do with making sure that as many students as possible develop a wider world view of what's going on. So this for study abroad has been absolutely essential. And it was very interesting because I mentioned before that we have alumni involved in this process, and I have a little group that lives abroad, live and work abroad. We have about 400, a few more than 400 alumni who live and work abroad. And a group of them who volunteered to correspond with me once in a while. So I toss out questions, and I want to hear what the response is from them. And I tossed out a question that I thought was a softball because I thought I knew the answer. And the question was, when you are interviewing someone for a job or for an internship, what value do you give to their study abroad experience? The answer was, none. This was shocking, right? But there was a caveat to the none, and it was extremely helpful. None. Unless they are capable of articulating why it was important, what difference it has made in their lives, and what it has to do with this job. And we thought, wow, that is something which we are not providing for our students. That is, we are not providing our students who return from study abroad the opportunity to develop that articulation or to even understand why what they have accomplished, what they have done, what they have experienced is important. So this is the kind of thinking that's been going on into this initiative. And we spent the first, it's divided into 3 different phases, and we took the first phase and called it a consolidation phase. So let's take the things that we're already doing, let's bring them together, make them coherent, make them comprehensive, and make them workable. At the same time, let's raise the profile of internationalism on campus. If I ask the question of you, how many international students do we have on campus? I don't know what the answer would be. The answer is 120, right? Now, again, a meaningless figure because lots of our peer schools have more international students, a higher international student population. But there's a huge difference. We have 3 of the 120, 3 of them are exchange students, and the rest are 4-year degree candidates. This is a colossal resource for us on our very own campus. Their diversity is immense. Their diversity in terms of geography, they come from everywhere. Cameroon, Ghana, Vietnam, South Korea, China, Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Kyrgyzstan, you name it, right? You name it. We could not ask for better international representation on campus. And they're here studying abroad, of course, with us, right? But when we talk to our US students about the importance of at least understanding what's going on in the rest of the world and making connections, making those connections it's really good for us to be able to point out our own international students as a resource. These are people who can help you think about what's going on in very different parts of the world, right? And there's another kind of leverage point that I used yesterday. We get to see each of the first-year students as part of their orientation to talk to them a little bit about internationalism and global learning. And it's kind of stunning, I guess, and maybe not fair for somebody who's only been on campus for 3 or 4 days and is 18 years old. But I do say to them, I want you to think about it this way. When I was a student at Washington and Lee, which was actually about the time a lot of you were students, I'm looking forward to my 45th reunion next spring. When I was a student at Washington and Lee, and maybe it was just out of ignorance, but the only people who really concerned me were the guy sitting on my right and the guy sitting on my left, because they both seemed a lot smarter than I was. At least I could track their path, right? So by the end of 4 years, when I sat in a few classes with them and so forth, I thought, well, yeah, they probably are a little smarter than I am, but not so much that I might not be able to compete. But here's the challenge for you as an 18-year-old now. Right? Don't worry about that guy sitting next to you. Don't worry about that woman sitting behind you. Right? Your competition right now is sitting somewhere in a classroom in Beijing, or Sao Paulo, or Mumbai, or Tbilisi, or London, or Brussels. And they are intensively driven by globalization. They are there and they've already learned 2 or 3 languages, and they're taking 7 courses and not 4. And those are the people that you need to know about. Both for the sake of competition, but even more importantly, for the sake of collaboration. And this is where our own international student population comes in. Because it is hard to imagine that this generation of students, the current 18 to 22-year-olds, it is hard to imagine that anybody with a Washington Lee degree who is meant to go out in the world as a liberal arts graduate and therefore a problem solver is not going to realize immediately that no single discipline, no single country, and no individual genius is going to solve the problems of the 21st century. We had a perfect example right here. I listened to all 3 of those talks, and I thought to myself, suppose I'd been a student and my class schedule had me going from economics to religion to Islamic studies. Suppose that were the case, and I listened to these 3 presentations. My reaction would be, gosh, I better learn something about history and sociology and cultural anthropology and politics, and as well as economics, and so forth and so on. This, of course, is the liberal arts tradition. And the liberal arts tradition and globalization, or global learning, fit together hand in glove. Nothing frustrates me more, and that's probably because I'm enormously biased and a very strong advocate of liberal education. Nothing bothers me more currently than the defensive stance that those who are also involved in liberal education seem to take about it. Everybody's saying it doesn't prepare anybody for a job, it doesn't prepare anybody for this, it doesn't prepare anybody for that. That is nonsense. Liberal arts has never been more important than it is right now. And the coincidence between a liberal arts education and the kind of interdisciplinarity that globalization requires is the perfect match. So that is what we're trying to accomplish finally when we talk about integrating global learning into the Washington and Lee experience. Study abroad is one component of it, but it also means that every discipline and all of the trans-disciplines do have global components that students and faculty need to identify together and exploit. That is certainly part of it. It also means that Lexington and this idea of the academic village, this 19th century idea which we all treasure, and I understand that, we must convert that into both an advantage and a starting point. Because technology means that you can live in a bucolic small town in Southwest Virginia and not be apart from, but be of the world. And that is what our final objective is. We will go through this, through the consolidation phase. The developmental phase has us working global learning throughout the curriculum, and the visionary phase, if you will, the visionary phase has us thinking of a facility, and I really want to kind of downplay this as a centerpiece. It's not meant to be a centerpiece of anything. It's a place that will accommodate what we do programmatically with regard to global learning. We will take that dismal, awful, ugly DuPont Hall and we will completely revolutionize it. We will renovate the first piece of DuPont, we'll tear off the back, and we will add on to that to produce what we will call a center for global learning. And center in the sense of hub. It will be the place to which you step off the campus in Lexington and you step into the world. And it will also be the place that pulses out from its center to the rest of the world. And this is to what we aspire. And my ultimate goal, besides being able to answer yes to the question of do we fulfill our mission, my ultimate goal is that we reach the point where we stop talking about international education, we stop talking about global learning, because we simply do it. That is my goal. We do it. That's it. And I think Washington Lee has every opportunity to be identified as such a place, to attract students and faculty for those very reasons. I know that many of the initiatives that we have underway are innovative, and we are, I would say, we're parlaying our very distinctive strengths, because, quite frankly, among our peers, there is one area in which we are unique, and that is we have the strongest possible liberal arts tradition. We have an astounding array of certified professional programs in business, finance, and journalism, and we have a school of law. None of our peers can match that. But we have to make sure that all of those sectors of the university are in consonance, not in competition. And I think all of us have identified that this area of global learning is where we can, in fact, come together as a university to distinguish Washington Lee in yet another way.